Swords. Let's talk about them. So, you will find a lot of people on the internet and TV shows and movies and comic books and everything else who believe that the katana is the ultimate weapon, greatest weapon ever made, etc., etc. These people are something that are referred to as katana cultists, and they are a product of the media and misinformed pop culture, etc. So I would like to address my thoughts on this issue, and before I begin, I'd like to mention that my two example swords here are a katana and a pretty terrible Norman sword, medieval era replica. These are both terrible swords. They were very cheap. That's not real pattern, or not real folded steel, that's just been carved into the blade. And this sword isn't even straight. But I'm just using them for general shape and comparisons, so yeah, keep that in mind. Anyway, katanas. Now, what are they known for being? They're known for being incredibly sharp and good at cutting things. Well, I'd like to say that they do have a good design for cutting things. You've got the curved blade, which does give you a lot of surface area, or edge length, in comparison to the sword's length, which is something that this sword won't have quite as good. As you can see, they're almost the same length, but this sword will in fact have more edge area because it's curved. That's pretty basic physics. On the other hand, or geometry, not physics, you know what I mean, math stuff. And you always see demonstrations of people cutting things with katanas and slashing things apart, and they look really impressive, except that if you watch anyone else's videos or demonstrations, you'll see that medieval swords cut things just as well, because the things they're cutting aren't that hard to cut. Now, yeah, it's probably true that if you were to stab into a chunk of metal or something, the katana might go a bit deeper, might puncture the breastplate a little better, but that's not what medieval swords were designed for, and it's not what katanas were designed for either. So that's kind of irrelevant. Now, with a medieval sword, your target areas are generally the chinks between the person's armor, because if they're wearing hardened steel armor, there's not much your sword can do against it. If you want to go through the armor, use a mace. So you're generally stabbing or cutting to the chinks in between the armor, which this shaped sword is fairly good at. Less so for stabbing, but in terms of slashing and hacking, it's fairly heavy towards the blade. It's got some weight going for it. It's very effective. This sword may be good at slashing at things, not that good at stabbing, but more importantly, the blade isn't very strong. And if you try taking the full force of another person's blade into this edge, you will ruin the edge and quite possibly break the sword. Now, another thing katanas are known for is the incredible quality of their steel. And the pop culture myth and thing that you see in movies and everything else is that they say the steel is folded thousands of times and by incredibly skilled craftsmen, and they become the greatest blades ever. This is not true, and if you fold your steel that many times, it is terrible. In actuality, the steel is folded 7 or 8 times in the making of a katana blade. And it does look cool. You get the wavy pattern down the blade, which is always nice. And it does sharpen well, and it's fairly good steel. On the other hand, in both sharpness and strength of the steel, it's still beat by Damascus steel from the Middle East. Also, Middle Eastern scimitars had a more curved blade, thus giving them a longer edge, thus making them actually better for cutting things with a sharp edge. Yeah, katanas don't win in that section. So, picture of a Middle Eastern scimitar here. look them up, look at some pictures. Damascus steel, very cool, very, very good quality steel. Which leads me to the next point, is that although this sword is from the, well, a replica from the medieval period, and is pretty simple, not good, as I already said, Viking swords, so pre to early medieval period, Dark Ages, I personally believe that these swords were some of the best ever made. Picture one here. They had very good fullers generally. Also, the blades were made with pattern welding, which is something done only by very skilled sword makers. It involves twisting different compositions of steel into a twisted rope, basically, of steel, and then forging that into the core of the blade, which makes this sword incredibly strong and flexible. And although it might not take an edge quite as well as some Eastern style swords, these swords were meant for killing people wearing leather armor or stabbing people. So the sharpness of the blade doesn't matter that much in practicality. They were also incredibly flexible compared to earlier swords, and were even believed to have mythical, magical powers because of this, because people hadn't seen steel that could bend like that before. The Ulfbert, in particular, was a type of sword made during the Dark Ages, which thoroughly confuses historians, because the name Ulfbert is written on the blade, although they came from a 200-year period, so it wasn't made by one person. Also, there's no evidence to suggest that they even came from the same place. So, very confusing to historians what that even means. It also doesn't translate. But these swords were incredibly well made, and could, in theory, bend completely double without breaking, which was very useful considering that a Viking tactic in swordplay was to catch your opponent's blade tip in your shield and push your shield forward until his sword broke. Doesn't work against Ulfbert blades. The other reason that they confuse historians is because they were made with Crucible Steel. Crucible Steel is not something that the Vikings made. There is no evidence that they had crucibles or knew how to make this type of steel, which makes it likely that they in fact had some trade with the Middle East and were using Middle Eastern steel for their blades. So then you've got the pattern weld made of Damascus steel, some of the best steel ever made. That's a pretty amazing blade when compared to a katana, which I'm not disputing that it's good steel, it's very good steel, but still isn't better. Every type of sword is made for a specific purpose. In the katana's case, they were intended for killing people as quickly as possible with as little blade work as possible. You weren't supposed to be doing a lot of edge-on-edge stuff with the sword. You were supposed to cut them in half and be done with it. And for that, they were very useful. Middle Eastern swords and medieval Europe swords, they were designed for, well, medieval swords were designed for sparring. Middle Eastern swords, I don't know that much about, but they were clearly intended for slashing and hacking because they do have very curved blades, often thickening towards the end. Medieval swords were intended for cutting between pieces of armor or simply cutting through softer armors. And for that, they were incredibly effective. Their steel was also some of the strongest and best steel ever made. So there is, in fact, no reason that a katana takes any more skill or is any better than any medieval or Dark Ages sword. Myth debunked, as far as anyone who watches this video, which is probably no one. But yes, I personally do not like katanas that much and do not understand where these myths come from. So, yeah. That is this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Like down there, comment, link to another video here or in the description.